Call to order this committee of the whole meeting for Friday, October 4th, 2024. The TNRD acknowledges that we connect with many First Nations communities across our vast regional district, and today we are located in the Tecumseh-Secwepemc territory, situated within the unceded lands of the Secwepemc Nation. The TNRD appreciates the partnership that we have with Tecumseh-Secwepemc and respect the territory and land on which we gather today. We do have one addition to the agenda, 4.3, a boundary review discussion and next steps. So I'd like to make a motion that we adopt the agenda as amended. Director Bass, thank you. All those in favor? Anyone opposed? Carried. We have the minutes of the July 18th Committee of the Whole meeting. Cast your mind back. We do have a recommendation. So moved, Director Laird, thank you. Seconded by Director Smith. Are there any errors or omissions? All right, on the question then, all those in favor? Is anyone opposed? That is carried. Moving right along, 4.1 Fire Smart Program Update, and I am going to hand the baton to General Manager of Operations, Mr. Vieira. Take it away.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning, everyone. Just before we turn it over to Ken McMillan, our Fire Smart coordinator, just wanted to give an update. We had a bit of a mix-up on the agenda. There actually is a written report that accompanies this verbal report you're going to hear. So the written report was not attached to the agenda. As you can see, we are going to attach that to the October 17th board agenda for information. So 2 weeks from now, when you are reviewing your agendas and feel like you've heard this information before, it'll be because Kim is presenting it to you now. But we think it's important to form a record and be before the board in written format. With that, I will turn it over to Kim to talk about all the great work she's been up to this year.
Morning, everybody. Thank you for having me. So my name is Kim McMillan, and I'm the lead Fire Smart coordinator for the Thompson-Nicola Regional District. Most of you know me or have seen me before. I am here to give you an update on what we've done in the last 6 months. So the first thing we'll talk about is a little bit of information regarding the grant. What we did in the 2023 year, where it gets complicated with where the grant ends and an actual year. Highlights of the activities we did, next steps, and then I'll give you an opportunity to ask me some questions. So as most of you know, this program is 100% grant funded for all eligible expenditures. The regional district, we are able to have $700,000, of which $200,000 is for the region itself, and each electoral area is $50,000, but it is in a pot of $700,000. So some of the eligible expenditures are wages, swag, any sort of promotional events and materials. So that could be if I throw a barbecue, vehicle expenses, chipper days, and then residential rebates will be in that as well. So in 2023, when we were approved, we were allowed to do foundational activities only. Those were hiring Fire Smart coordinators, the creation of our community wildfire resiliency plans, which are CWRPs, attend the Fire Smart conference, provide Fire Smart education to our residents, and then form our community Fire Smart and resiliency committee. So educational events, this is just an example of what we've done. We provided 24 educational events across the region. One is coming on October 12th, so I put it in there as well. So we attended things from rodeos, cleanup days, provincial winter fairs and had a booth, or we sat in Stump Lake in cul-de-sac and had a presentation, and then went around and did a whole bunch of assessments in that area. One of our most notable presentations was BC Wildfire asked us to come out and do a Fire Smart presentation on short notice. And on July 17th, we went out there and did that. It was Dan Funk, who's our Fire Smart coordinator, and then also Joe Kang was there from Emergency Services. In the middle of the presentation, it turned into an evacuation, which was a little bit crazy, but it was also really highlighted the importance of fire smarting properties. Unfortunately, at this stage of the game, we were too late. But when we were asked to come out by BC Wildfire, they anticipated that we had a little bit more time. So Wildfire is definitely relying on us to get that education out, but they're also contacting us directly when they want us to be out there and helping a community in need. That was a picture taken by, if I can go back, that was taken when they were actually in the presentation. So the fire came over the hill and was a little bit close. So what we have done, so we launched our program on March 18th of this year. We visited 314 properties across the region and assessed 504 structures. So I've broken it down in how many in each electoral area. Some of the electoral areas have more, but there's also more population in some electoral areas. We did put out press releases saying that this was something we did for free, but we have not really had a chance to even solicit people for Fire Smart assessments because it was just very busy. Requests per electoral area. So in B alone, you can see there's a bit of a difference. Although we did do on this page 58 assessments in electoral area B, it seems a bit strange to see only 0.47% was requested from area B. But one request came in and we did all 58 assessments of those properties. So B is good. B is good. So this type of data that we're collecting is going to really help us moving forward into 2025 and knowing where we need to target our areas where people are not getting our message or where fire smarting needs to go. The CWRPs also lays out different areas and highlights different areas where we need to spend a little bit more attention as well. So next steps. So moving into 2025, we are going to continue with region-wide education throughout the whole district. That'll include property assessments, community events, presentations, booths, attending, the provincial winter fair or the Garlic Fest, that type of thing. We're going to work towards implementing a rebate program, a homeowner rebate program. We anticipate that this will be a rebate to the residents as long as they've met the eligibility requirements of maximum maybe $500. This is definitely something we might have to do in a two intake process just to make sure that it doesn't tax our finance department. We're going to complete critical infrastructure assessments across the region. We've already started this with our fire halls, but we're going to move on to water systems and anything, community halls, anything that's definitely what we consider critical infrastructure. That's also been laid out in our CWRPs as which way we have to go. Providing chipper days for the community throughout the region. Well, we're even going to do this in a couple of weeks. We were able to work with Paul Lake Community Association, and on October 15th, we're going to have our first chipper day. We're working with a local company who's going to come up. All the woody debris will be at the curbside, and we'll just run along the street, grabbing it as we go. Obviously, it's a pilot project, but this is something that we think will really help fire smart properties across our region. So I anticipate this is going to go well, and we're going to be moving into other areas in the region very soon. Updates to the Fire Smart app to create user efficiency. So through our GIS department, we've been really lucky to be able to put everything online, which helps us collect all the data. As we've run through this season, we found where there's some improvements that we can make. So over the winter, we're going to increase those improvements and make it better. And lastly, we originally had our committee, which was appointed, one committee member was appointed by each electoral area representative. Once we received our CWRP, it looks like they want us to expand our committee to include stakeholders like BC Wildfire, BC Parks, community forest organizations, some of the local First Nations. So they really want it to be a little bit more robust than just on residents only. I don't want to lose that committee that you guys have created. So I think maybe, I'm not sure they'll integrate, but maybe we'll do two separate things, because I've had and received a lot of great information from the residents out there on what they're looking for. But that will be something that we'll probably have to move towards. Any question?
Well, first of all, thank you very much. On a personal note, the Village of Ashcroft is just at phase 1. We just got approved for our funding. So I'm looking forward to all the great things we can do in the second year, because the first year is largely administrative and developing the plan. But thank you for all that. Okay, questions? I have Director Grenier will start us off.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for the presentation. I was at the Lac Lejeune Annual General Meeting this weekend, and they had put together a 30-page Fire Smart program for their community. And they got a 1-page letter back from the government saying, yeah, you don't qualify, or it was not acceptable, or didn't meet some threshold. So there's a little bit of despondency about that. Just wondering where we might go from there so we can keep up some of the momentum on what they're trying to do.
I'm wondering if did they apply for, and maybe you don't know, but a neighborhood wildfire, I can't remember the exact, is that it?
Yeah,
Okay.
something like that.
Okay, so I have reached out to them, and unfortunately our schedules haven't aligned, but they're definitely one of the communities that our Chipper Day is high on my list to get going on that. Maybe from there, they will be able to become a recognized neighborhood. I think they have to meet certain benchmarks in order to be able to get to that part. That's handled more through Fire Smart Canada than through me, but I think that if they reach out, we can maybe guide them to the right thing and get them there. I would like all of our communities to be Fire Smart, the communities, that would be helpful.
Thank you. I have Director Middleton.
Thank you. It was a good year in a sense for our region, and that we weren't overwhelmed with fires, with the exception of a few areas. Excuse me. How do we plan to sort of keep residents engaged in the Fire Smart program, where I sense like everybody's memories are very short, and now we're sort of saying, okay, well, this year maybe wasn't so bad. Are they going to start to sort of move their eyes away from fire smarting, thinking that maybe they don't need to do this anymore? Have we got like kind of a plan to make sure that we stay, in the face of the residents, to make sure that this year, which was considered by all senses to be a normal year, that we don't sort of lose that interest?
Great question. That we even saw that as how the summer kind of rolled along. So right now I'm not getting requests for Fire Smart assessments, because it's now everybody's thinking winter. Spring, it will amp up again because everybody's thinking fires. I think that the message from Fire Smart BC, it's definitely out there. It's on billboards. They're doing a great job of advertising the word Fire Smart and making it kind of like a household word. That's not gonna go down. We need to get the message across that it's not a matter of when, it's if, or it's not a matter of if, it's when. So the fires are gonna happen. We just don't know when, but it will happen. So it's gonna be my job to make sure that we're out there at all the community events. So our name and face is out there. Any sort of marketing we can do, we will. And then on top of everything that we do at the regional district, it's done at a provincial level. Oh, gee.
And just to add to that, to go back to Kim talking about our program, what we're looking for next year is we're gonna offer people cash. So that's gonna ramp things up as well. So the rebate program is something that we wanted to get going as soon as possible. We couldn't make it happen this year, but the idea is that if you do, if you have an assessment and you achieve everything, then there's a cash compensation that we can offer that then, you know, people use towards their offsetting their high insurance costs in rural areas, that sort of thing.
Director Sarai.
Thank you, Madam. You mentioned that shipping days and you got a local businessman helping and other areas will be following. Is there a huge volume in that shipping day? Or is that businessman going to be volunteering to the other areas as well? Because we have a local pulp mill that is in dire need of fiber. Is there a volume enough there that Kruger could be involved in assisting in that? And we could be that conduit to connect those two.
I told Kim I'd jump on that because bit on the solid waste side as well that I've experience on. So a couple things. Glad we're doing this shipping day. This is the first one, so we don't know what those volumes are going to look like and how it's going to work, because it's a little unique in rural areas. How many people just do this all the time and are going to bring them straight to to a depot versus bring it to the curb. Also on the pulp mill side, we've kind of investigated that avenue on the solid waste facilities side, and unfortunately the quality is just not there that the pulp mills are interested in that type of material. They need larger logs and a better quality fiber.
Director Smith.
Thank you, Chair. On the chipping side, what do the residents, are they informed as to what type of product they can put at the side of the road? What size is is this just one of those little Vermeer things that they pull behind the truck?
Yes, so we sent out a press release just saying what the specs are, what type of material they can bring. This is not meant to be falling a foot, a 12-inch tree. It's 5 to 6 inch diameter maximum. And it's basically all of your yard waste and debris. Any sort of larger material, that would be something that they need to take down themselves. Am I able to speak to one other question, just to back to Director Middleton? Another thing that I was thinking while Jamie was talking is insurance is going to play a big part in FireSmart. So I think that the insurance companies are going to be working, well, they're already working with FireSmart. And if you have a FireSmart assessment and you follow those recommendations that we lay out, like removing your trees or taking your wood pile away from the house, they're going to give you a decrease on insurance. So, or maybe not an increase in your insurance. I think that is really going to help drive the fact of fire smarting being important.
And also just to that, Director Smith, I know in Ashcroft, I believe in Cache Creek as well, when we collect our yard waste in the spring from residents, we send out information. So branches can only be so long, they can only be so much in diameter, leaves can't be bagged, they have to be placed away from fences, from electrical boxes, etc. Don't put them out before such and such a date, which is more honored in the breach than the observance. People put them out 2 weeks in advance. But people do, they realize that, no, you're not chopping down that 60-year-old Douglas fir that's been in your yard for years. Hopefully. Director Karpuk.
Thank you, Chair. Courtney McMillan, I'm just curious how much overlap we have with this program through our provincial BC Wildfire, which is located here at Kamloops, and the Forest Enhancement Society BC, which looks kind of more at the Crown land, which may surround a lot of these private homes. I have a supplemental to that, but I'm just curious where we're at with that sort of liaison work.
So our program is ultimately funded through Ministry of Forests. And so everything that we do has to be approved by BC Wildfire. So when I applied for the grant and I determined this is what I believe our eligible activities are, I sat down with Wildfire and we discussed what they wanted us to do. Moving into the Crown land, there is a second stream through FireSmart to be able to do prescriptions on Crown land. That is not something that the TNRD is taking on at this time. We just don't have the capacity to do that. But that said, when I have a resident who calls in, and this happens often, saying they're very concerned about the Crown land behind their house, or some sort of fuel mitigation anywhere, or even burn piles. I have contacts through the different areas through wildfire to reach out, and then they will send somebody out and determine its priority list, and then go from there on whether they determine that they're going to do that. Also earlier this spring, when wildfire is just training all of their new recruits kind of thing, they do reach out and ask if there's any areas on Crown where they could go in and do a quick 7-day project. They don't want it to be too long, only because in that case, if there's a fire, they don't want to have it kind of half done. They'll go out and train on these different areas. So whether it's going in and burning or I'm not exactly sure what they do, but that is something that they're working with us as well.
So supplemental to that, this spring when I was out at BC Wildfire for their sort of pre-season update, had the opportunity to go out there. And just as a bit of background, I'm actually a trained fire ecologist, past life, but in that venue, they also opened up the idea that if there was any need for chainsaw work, they're desperately looking at different ends of the season to allow their workers to get more experience. So that kind of project opportunity may be coordinated through the TNRD if there was a collection of homes, whether it was up in Lac Lejeune or wherever, a neighborhood. They were quite interested in getting out there and hands-on larger trees, pruning and things like that. They may not be doing the fuel mitigation by removing it, but they can take the larger timbers down and make it safe for the community to kind of work on the smaller debris that's left behind. So that's something to keep in mind. The other one is Mike Aldridge, who is their FireSmart coordinator, has said they have an endless pot of money for people who want to do FireSmart programs. I'm just not sure where that overlaps with the TNRD, because it does go to different community groups, social clubs, service groups, that sort of thing. And it's up to 150,000 per grant. I know the city of Kamloops gets some for some of our green space. Some of the outlying areas have started to take advantage of that as a little rod and gun club sort of thing, but I'm not sure how that also integrates with our program.
So Mike works in the stream 2 part of things, so the mitigation on the Crown land. So we deal with Vanessa Purvis, who's taken over that spot. Mike was doing both for a little bit. So that would be more on, I don't really have a lot to do with him, to be fair, because we're not in that pot, but those definitely something to keep in mind. If a community group reaches out, I'll reach out to Mike and go from there. Thank you.
Next, I have Director Houghton.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just an update. I had the opportunity last evening to attend the first ever OCP meeting I've ever been involved with. It was at Pritchard, and wildfires and FireSmart was a hot topic, and our staff here did a great job of putting that forward as part of the agenda in the OCP, and I'm going to make sure that the remaining 2 that we have, or I have, in Knutsford and Westwold, I'm going to target that as a very important part of planning for the future. So, and on another note, I'm planning on getting Kruger, as Director Sarai said, and Aero Environmental up to the ranch later on this year, and I guess you call it FireSmart, or private land, after our logging operations. Right now, Kruger has an issue with their boilers, and they're not accepting any hog fuel. So I talked to Tom Hoffman at UBCM and again last week, and he's going to keep us in the loop and work with Aero to get our private lands on the outside of Knutsford all chipped and gone down to the mill. So, you know, us private folks are doing, I think, a great job in the rural areas around Kamloops. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else have any questions or comments on FireSmart? Thank you very much for the presentation and keep up the excellent work and look forward to next year's report. All right, our second presentation is about asset management review and recommendations, and I'm going to hand over to CAO Hildebrand.
Thank you, Chair Roden, and good morning, Board of Directors. I'd like to just take a brief moment and introduce the next topic along with our guests that will be walking us through our asset management strategy and policy recommendations. As you know, this is a very important initiative, and we are now at the point where we want to share some of the results, the recommendations, and next steps. This plan has taken far too long to formalize over the years with floods and fires and all sorts of things that have gotten in the way. I'm happy we are now in a position to formally move ahead with a strategy. It'll provide improved clarity and direction to our financial planning process and provide clear expectations for our staff and the organization as a whole. We still have a lot of work to do, of course, but we're happy that we're finally at this point. So Christopher Payne from Fit Consulting and John Wenninger from JW Infrastructure Planning were hired to conduct asset management maturity assessments, review our asset management policy, and develop an asset management strategy. And they're with us today. They're going to walk us through the presentation. Also in the room is Na Toy, our Manager of Strategic Support Services, who has been leading this initiative internally and is here to answer any questions as well. So welcome to those on screen, and I would assume it's maybe Chris that's going to take it away.
Yeah, you bet. Thanks, Scott. And good morning to everyone at the Regional District this morning. I'm going to lead you through the presentation today. Thanks very much for that introduction. John's with me as well, who's been instrumental in preparing the information and conducting the assessments. So we're looking forward to just having that conversation with the board today in anticipation of a formal asset management strategy being prepared. So let me just see if I can share my screen here. They gave me the controls earlier today, so that was quite helpful. There we go. Okay. Okay, so we'll just introduce the project a little bit for the board. You may recall we met earlier in the year just to do a little bit of asset management training, introduce some of the larger themes and concepts to asset management. And since then, we've worked closely with your staff, both vertically and horizontally across the organization to conduct some asset management capacity assessment and get to know the organization on a more deep level. So there's three main components to this project. There was the policy review and update. So we're going to talk about that today, as well as the capacity assessment, which has been conducted, and we'll go over the results of that, the findings of that, and some of the recommendations that are coming from that. And then that really all formulates into and culminates into your asset management strategy and roadmap development. Taking a little bit of a different approach here, we've consulted very closely with your staff, especially your senior leadership team, in terms of the anticipated components in the asset management strategy. We're also doing that here with the board today, and then that way, the product that you have before you is familiar and supportable. So I just want to take one quick brief moment to talk about the asset management framework that most local governments in BC follow, which we introduced earlier this year when we talked, when we did a little bit of the training, and just remind folks kind of where we are in that process, because asset management is a really big topic. Lots of things that you can do in asset management and what you're doing. So what really are we doing in the scope of this project? And we can sort of demonstrate that using the asset management BC framework wheel, which, by the way, my partner John Wenninger was instrumental in helping prepare this framework for all of BC. So it's a really good framework. You note in asset management, it's iterative, it's ongoing. There's always something you can do. There's always something you can improve in asset management. It never ends. So, if you ever ask the question, did we get asset management done? We're always doing asset management. So you'll recall, here's the yellow part of the wheel, the planning part of the wheel. You've got some asset management plans, for instance, that have already been prepared for utility, for your utility assets. You've got an asset management policy. We're recommending some enhancements to it. But there's this square there, your asset management strategy. And your asset management strategy really answers the question, well, what part of this giant wheel do we want to focus on? You know, we conduct an asset management competency and maturity assessment to determine where are some good opportunities to improve over the next 5 years. And then the asset management strategy, you know, is direction to your staff to go and implement those select improvements over the next 5 years. So it's a nice, an asset management strategy is a nice, succinct vision for the short term, the midterm, between 1 and 5 years. Okay, so we'll just begin today, and just so anyone's aware, we're more than happy to answer any questions as we go through the presentation. If you want to save the questions for the end, you know, I'll leave it to the chair how to manage that. But we're more than happy to answer any questions as we go through. So we'll just begin today to talk about the asset management policy review. We took a broader approach to the policy review than is typically conducted, because you know, asset management being a multidisciplinary, multi-departmental process, it's important to see that there's asset management policy integrated through operations throughout the organization. And so having an asset management policy is foundational, and you have an asset management policy, but seeing evidence of that asset management, those principles integrated into other policies and operations is really the next level. So it's a formal document that outlines an organization approach to managing its assets, and it provides a structured framework to ensure assets are managed efficiently, and they're contributing to the overall success and priorities and vision of the organization. So the scope of this of our policy review was really to look at your asset management policy and just determine, you know, is there best practices that can inform improving that policy. And there's a couple best practices documents that we relied on for that. And then also, as I mentioned, review other corporate policies to determine if there's asset management integration opportunities. And we do have some enhancements that we're recommending as a result of that. So there's, you know, there's four main sections in best practices for an asset management policy. And the best practice framework that we use is a Federation of Canadian Municipalities framework, which outlines how to approach policy development for asset management and how to approach your strategy development. And they recommended intent, scope, principles, responsibilities, and you do have those sections. But we just wanted to take a closer look within those sections to see if there was any opportunity for enhancement there. In the policy section, we found you're scoring well, you've got pretty, you know, in general terms, pretty well a best practice asset management policy already in place. There was some enhancements we're recommending to denote the organization's commitment to long-term sustainability and environmental adaptability. So we provided, you know, a marked up version of the asset management policy to your staff for consideration, which essentially embodies the recommendations actually embody what you really are already doing. So it's not a departure from what the organization's approach to asset management is throughout the organization. It's just a recognition of it in the policy. And so one of the things that we recommended is that your policy mentioned that you're really taking a quadruple bottom line approach to decision making. And like I said, your organization appears to already be doing that. So it's just reflecting that in the policy. So for instance, this is one of the enhancements that we marked up in the asset management policy version. Consider investment decisions using quadruple bottom line, sustainability criteria with respect to economic, environmental, social, and cultural outcomes. Okay, so we'll talk about other corporate policies, and there's usually some low-hanging fruit, I would say, in terms of corporate policies that can be enhanced or reflect asset management principles. And one of them happens to be your procurement policy. And in all other respects, you know, I'm a previous CFO. I think your procurement policy is a good policy. And typically, again, this is the approach that people are taking in their procurement, but you want it reflected in black and white writing for those in the organization that perhaps aren't taking that approach. So one of the main focal points of enhancing your procurement policy was to integrate the consideration of life cycle costing when assigning financial scoring. Certainly when you go about procuring goods and services, the financial impact of that decision is something that's considered in evaluating different bids and different RFPs. And that's pretty familiar from anyone who's ever awarded an RFP or participating in the evaluation. But what does financial performance mean? And so we're recommending that be more clearly defined to say the best life cycle costs. And again, intuitively, people generally understand this. I always use the example of if your administration would like to purchase a new software. And if they're just scoring their bids based on the cost to purchase the software and implement the software, but not considering all of the lifecycle costs, which would include annual licensing fees, annual maintenance, then they might be selecting a more expensive option. Of course, when it comes to procurement, financial considerations aren't the only consideration. You're doing a quadruple bottom line in many cases as well. But you want to have the clearest indication of financial benefit identified, and that's a way to go about it. And like I said, there's many staff are already doing that. They're already saying, well, this might appear to be less expensive, but we know it's going to cost us more in the long run, so we're going to score it lower. Folks are already inherently doing that, but identifying that in a policy would make it clear to folks throughout the organization that that's what you support in terms of best practices. And I do know that the regional district is looking to procure an ERP system for their accounting. So it's a good opportunity. I do believe, though, that's the approach that Carla would have taken anyways, because she's already performing at that level, but it's just something to note. There are some other policies we're recommending for the financial plan, and I will draw a distinction between the financial plan that is prepared for local governments, for regional districts versus municipalities. And I don't hide the fact that my experience prior to being a consultant is 100% working for municipalities. So I understand municipalities a lot more clearly. Municipalities are required to have financial plan policy in their financial plan bylaw. Usually it relates to tax rates and various other things. That's not the case with regional districts. Typical regional district financial plan bylaw is a schedule of expenditure authorities, and that's great. And so this idea would be novel. It's something to consider, but it's supported by your CFO and your strategic leadership team. And it would be to integrate policy provisions that require life cycle costing for new capital services and donated capital. So, often regional districts are the repository of capital from services, from improvement districts that you didn't necessarily provision to begin with. And you have a great financial sustainability policy in place for receiving donated capital, and I definitely applaud you for having that. It's a leading policy. But the implications, if you do receive new capital, should be integrated into your financial plan bylaw. And again, I repeat that this is already taking place. Your CFO, for instance, recognizes that it's not just the cost to purchase or construct a capital that needs to be in the financial plan. It's also the cost to operate that capital. So if the board has said, yes, please proceed in constructing that capital, the board is also effectively saying, yes, please operate that. And the financial resources to operate that capital through its life cycle needs to be reflected in the financial plan. And your CFO is already making sure that's happening. She's communicating that when it happens. But for posterity, and again, for best practice, why not embody that as a policy in your financial plan bylaw? The next policy provision, and again, it's somewhat vague, but it is principle based, is the requirement for your financial plan to reflect approved levels of service. And the principle behind this, again, is that the board is responsible for setting the service level vision for the community. You get to decide what an appropriate level risk for the community is. You get to decide what the quality of the services is, and to what extent that service is provided for the community. It's really not, I would say, it's not appropriate for staff to be making levels of services decisions that are contrary to the board's vision. So if the board, for instance, wants recreational services to achieve certain objectives, it's really not appropriate for staff to unilaterally decide not to achieve those levels of services. So this sets the general direction for the organization that staff are to achieve the levels of service that are directed by the board, and those levels of service need to be supported in the financial plan bylaw. And you can't have one without the other. You can't have staff saying, yes, we can achieve those levels of services, but we don't have the financial resources to do so. Rather, it's important for staff to communicate if there is a financial gap between the desired levels of service that the board has and what's actually embodied in the financial plan bylaw. The board, at the end of the day, if I could be candid and say, you can contradict yourself in as much as you can say we would like you to achieve these levels of service, but we're only approving financial expenditures of a certain level. It doesn't happen often because at some point that contradiction comes home to roost, and staff just says we're just not able to achieve what you're wanting for the approval that you have in the expenditures. But you want those two things aligned. So again, this recommendation, I wouldn't take it lightly, only because it would be novel for a regional district in BC to have a policy section in your financial plan bylaw. But it would certainly be a powerful principle setting tool for you, especially when it comes to asset management. So some other major policy documents are official community plans. And I understand it's not necessarily a requirement for regional districts to have official community plans. So the fact that you have many, is a really positive sign, I think, at least in terms of the board and establishing a vision for your large community. There is, one of your official community plans integrates wording around financial sustainability or sustainability in general, and sustainability in general includes financial sustainability. We really do recommend integrating wording around financial sustainability into your OCPs, only because you may have a land use vision in terms of the types of uses that in what areas of your regional district you want. But if providing for such land use is just financially not feasible, again, intuitively that won't happen. And so there is a caveat that you are looking at financial sustainability in your land use decisions as well, which is difficult because, of course, you're using your crystal ball to look forward and see what's possible. But there's a range of financial sustainability judgments that can be made. So we're recommending that that language specifically reference financial sustainability and be integrated into the OCPs that don't currently have it. Okay, and then I think the last policy where we have recommended, we did review a bunch of other policies that aren't listed here, but we found that they integrated asset management principles well, and so we don't have recommendations around that. But the surplus and reserve policy, I know, is something that is being contemplated right now. So we had a discussion with Carla and her colleagues and talked about what's some vision you could have for the surplus and reserve policy. And one of the things that we were thinking would be helpful for sustainable service delivery would be to have dedicated funding sources for infrastructure replacement. And this really does result in the board having to prioritize your funding sources. Right now, you have some funding sources that are, well, I'll use your Canada Community Building Fund as an example. I believe that is allocated based on, to the different electoral areas, based on, I believe it was per capita, if I'm not mistaken, which is great. But can those funds then be used for building and constructing new capital, or replacing existing capital? And also, I believe there's some provision to use it for community groups or provide it for community groups. We're really recommending that the board dedicate funding sources for infrastructure replacement, just given the financial, or just given the service sustainability challenges that the board has. And that may or may not be something that the board supports. Certainly, it's a question that will come up when your integrated surplus and reserve policy discussions take place later on. And the other thing is you may want to tie your reserve levels to your average age of asset class. This is a sort of a common question I get from the governance folks throughout the province is, what should our reserve levels be? What's an appropriate reserve level? And just like any good CFO or engineer, I say, well, it depends. It's always the easy answer. Well, it depends. Well, I'll give you an example of why it depends. Suppose you're a brand new community with brand new assets that are in really good condition, that are only maybe 5 to 10% through their useful life. So for instance, let's say you have a sewer treatment plant that's worth $100 million and you're 5 to 10% through its useful life. If you have no reserves set aside to replace that treatment plant in 50, 60, 70, 80 years, it's not as concerning now because you're at the early stages of its life cycle. If, however, the treatment plant is coming up due for replacement in the next 10 to 20 years and you have no reserves, that is more concerning because you're further along in the life cycle. So whatever your philosophy is for whether or not you fund your reserve levels and accumulate reserves or not, it can be tied to that life cycle. So again, for instance, there's some municipalities and some local governments out there that really like to fund their reserve levels quite sustainably, so that when assets come due for replacement, they've got a pool of money to use for that. And then there's some municipalities that prefer to take on debt at the end of the life cycle, so they don't have large reserve balances. Both of those are appropriate for different reasons, depending on your philosophy. But the key is that whatever you decide your reserve contribution should be, it should be proportionate to where you are in your life cycle. So it's a bit more complex of a process to do that, rather than just saying 4% of revenue or 4% of, there's some other benchmarks that are commonly used that are easier to use. This requires a little bit more analysis, but it's stronger principles. Final two policies. Again, we talked about your community works fund policy. We're recommending that you develop a policy, or you amend the policy to prioritize the use of gas tax funds for infrastructure replacement, or in the case where you need to achieve minimum regulatory levels of service. I'll let you debate that at some point. It doesn't have to be debated today, but it is a recommendation that we're putting forward. And then with your use of corporate vehicles, you actually, some of your staff said, well, this is kind of an outdated policy anyways, but I still would say that your corporate vehicles policy is leading compared to your peers, because at the very least, it identifies when vehicles should be replaced. Many municipalities and regional districts lack a corporate vehicles policy, and they simply leave it to the best judgment of staff to replace vehicles, but that's often influenced by how much money you have in the reserve. So you really want your staff making the decisions that are based on the best life cycle costs, not whether or not there's money in the reserve next year or the year after. Because what'll happen is often you'll defer replacing a vehicle because you don't have money in a reserve. And what happens is the taxpayer really ends up paying more over the life cycle because the extra maintenance costs, the downtime for the vehicles, etc., they really exceed what would otherwise be, the big capital costs spread over the life of the asset. So like I said, your current policy is actually already leading in that respect. It identifies sort of a time frame to replace it, and the objective behind that is to minimize life cycle costs. So you're doing a good job there, and that's reflected in your operational, your actual operations. But we just recommend generalizing that language to not have a static number of years, but actually have the term of ownership be reflective of the lowest life cycle cost. So something general like that. And this is sort of important only because the structure of your fleet is changing, right? Some fleets are becoming more electrified, or even if that's not the case, you're seeing fleet that are a lot more sophisticated in terms of technology. The parts, etc., are different. The maintenance, the back orders for those parts are different. So the life cycle costs the life cycle is changing, and the ideal life cycle is changing. So you just want to make sure that you can respond to that different life cycle rather than adhere to a strict timeline for replacement. Okay, so that's the policy stuff. You will see those policy recommendations in the strategy that comes forward as well. And your staff have had a lot of good input into that, so we really appreciate the efforts. And I meant to mention at the top of the presentation that the engagement seems to be on time. We're making really good progress with everything, and that's primarily due to the organizational skills and the project management skills of Na. She just refuses to let anyone down, so it's really appreciated. So we conducted an asset management capacity assessment. This is also sometimes referred to as a maturity assessment, competency assessment. That terminology sounds a little bit less positive. We prefer the term capacity assessment. The objective of it was to assess the current status of asset management in the regional district. So let me just give you an example here again. Here's the asset management BC wheel. And you notice, one big chunk of that is assess, right? You need to know what the conditions of your assets are at certain points. You need to know what the condition of your asset management practices are. You need to know the condition of your asset inventory data, etc. So assessing where the organization is important. And you always are going to be assessing and reassessing and forever and ever. So the asset management capacity assessment was really important for us to understand where the opportunities are to advance asset management corporately and reflect that in the asset management strategy. So we almost always bundle an asset management maturity assessment with an asset management strategy engagement. They're almost inseparable, because if you don't really know the organization, and then you can't recommend where you want to achieve progress. We also wanted, as part of this, to create an objective benchmark. So if the board adopts the asset management strategy and the performance measures therein, you'll be able to go back and ask your staff, how well did you achieve those benchmark ratings? And they're fairly objective, so you can really rate your performance as a board and staff. We utilized the FCM readiness scale. There's several acceptable and best practice frameworks for assessments, for asset management maturity assessments. We chose the FCM. We'll talk about that a little bit later, because it has some advantages in our mind. And we wanted to gain a thorough understanding of what's working well and where there are some challenges. Okay. So here's the framework that we chose, FCM Asset Management Readiness Scale. It is a national standard. The national standard is based on international best practices. You know, it does reflect the principles and approach that are in ISO, for instance, the International Organization for Standardization, as well as IPWA, and I'm forgetting another framework, but they all essentially reflect the same approach and principles. We think this is well suited for Canadian municipalities. Often you are preparing grants to the federal government and they ask you to rate yourself using an FCM readiness scale. So this gives you a little bit of an advantage in terms of articulating how a grant application can support asset management progress. So you're able to submit a grant to FCM and say, if you give us this money, we will be able to achieve a greater level of asset management maturity, and we can demonstrate that. So it gives you a bit of a leg up there. So that's another reason why we did that. There's 5 main competencies in it. You can see them right there. Policy and governance is the first one. People leadership, data information, planning, decision-making, and contribution to the asset management practice. So we just ask the organization through a very methodical approach, how are we doing in all of these categories? And those categories are broken down into some subcategories here. But this gives you some insight. I won't read the entire slide here, but I'll give you some insight. You know, so for policy and governance, we ask questions about, do you have a policy? Does that policy reflect best practices? Do you have a strategy and a roadmap? And are you measuring and reporting performance, right? And right off the bat here, we can answer some of these questions. Yes, we got a policy. Generally, it adheres to best practices. You don't have a strategy, so you would score lower on that, but presumably you will have a strategy. And then how well are you measuring performance? And it's kind of middle of the ground there. It's also other things like people in leadership. How well resourced are you to advance asset management progress? And you know, I don't want to set the I don't want to set the expectation that an asset management strategy necessarily results in us recommending 20 FTEs to advance asset management in the organization, because you can achieve a certain level of competency. I'm just using that in quotes. That is not the highest competency possible, but boards have to balance many conflicting objectives for your community. And so you are constantly prioritizing. So you may just say, well, we only want to achieve a rating of a 4 for your asset management competency, because given the mix of other priorities we have, that's I think the biggest bang for our buck. And actually, you will see that here. You know, we talked to your staff about, do you want to be at a level 5 here? Does that make sense for your organization? And the answer was no. You know, contribution to an asset management practice will be an example of that. We'll talk about it later. So it's a real practical approach to improving asset management in your organization, and and how it's the context is very localized to you. So here's how we went about it. We did an online survey. The online survey reflected all the questions that you would typically ask in the FCM readiness scale. And quite frankly, we expected that not everyone would understand necessarily what's even being asked of them in the survey. Not everyone understands what an asset management strategy even is. What is an asset management plan? You know, we don't expect everyone to have thorough knowledge, but it provided insight into the organization, the organizational insight into asset management. So it was a necessary thing, and it also helped us really focus our questions and discussion in the group interviews that took place shortly thereafter. And like I said, the vision from your leadership team here was to make sure that we reflect the organization's understanding horizontally and vertically. And it was a really great cross-section of people that came to the table and provided insight. And without their insight, I think our findings would definitely have been lacking. So again, I applaud that approach by NA and by the senior leadership team. And then we brought those findings to the senior leadership interviews and refined our understanding that way. So we're going to go through the asset management findings here. Then that leads us to the recommendations. The recommendations are really what's going to be embodied in your asset management strategy. That's why that sort of context here is important. Okay, so again, the first one was policy and governance. And it was really to look at your policies and seeing how those policies are brought to life, whether or not they're brought to life through a strategy or roadmap, and whether or not the organization is measuring and monitoring. Okay, so it's to create that policy structure in your organization and lay out goals and how they're going to be achieved and how you're going to align corporate goals. Okay. So the strengths that we found when we looked at this competency was that there's a financial sustainability policy, right? And financial sustainability and asset management, they're identified as priorities in your strategic plan. So the board has already said this is important to us, that that importance is being reflected by your staff. And that's why, you know, this project itself, it has come to life. There was an asset management improvement recommendation report in 2016. You know, your CAO already mentioned some of the factors that led to the stalling of that. I would say, you know, I think this will be a theme that I talk about a couple times in this presentation. Not having a dedicated cross-departmental resource for advancing asset management is usually a stumbling block for organizations, right? And there's no lack of commitment to asset management from your leadership team and the various staff. It's just you get sidelined with other priorities. You know, I was a CFO for over a decade, and I led asset management many times in the organization, and we made great progress. But you better believe around budget time and around year end, my focus was not on asset management. And so some of the momentum that we had with respect to asset management stalled. And I always liken asset management to someone is pushing a stone, a big rock up a hill. And it helps if there's a couple people pushing that rock up the hill, because if one person stops, that rock is going to roll backwards, right? And so, you know, one of the recommendations you'll find later on is to establish that FTE that is really prioritized to advancing and ensuring that the organization is moving in the right direction. Really need that leader. Another strength here is that there was an asset management policy adopted in 2019, and that asset management policy was generally best practices. Okay, some of the challenges here. As mentioned, asset management stalled due to staff changes, leadership changes, shift in priorities, you know, wildfires, COVID-19. There's a plethora of legitimately good reasons why asset management progress has stalled. Remember, asset management never stops. You are in the business of infrastructure, but advancing asset management stalled. Some department-specific asset management progress has been made, but most of the recommendations that were made in that capacity assessment were not implemented, and so it almost feels a little bit like stealing. A lot of the stuff that we're recommending you would see in a previous version of a capacity assessment, but hopefully you see some value add as well. The asset management policy is not generally referenced by the board or staff to guide decisions, so we can integrate that into our processes a little bit more. And then progress isn't really being monitored. Now, yes, you know, the board is asking your CAO and asking your senior leadership team, what are you doing to advance asset management, and what is the status of this certain project? But, you know, we're really thinking that there should be some performance measures that the board is comfortable asking for, and that staff can produce with not a ton of effort, right? It's always a cost benefit. So we would say performance is not being monitored in that respect. The second category, data and information. And it's really about how your organization collects and uses data and performance data and financial data. So it's not just about having an inventory, an asset management inventory. It's also about what financial information do you have, and what performance data do you have as well. So it helps you improve your data management practices in your organization. So some strengths are, you've got a good GIS system. We did a data review, a data audit. And so those are really your core services, and they account for most of your infrastructures, your linear assets, right? And so you've got a relatively complete asset inventory for that. And that's, that's essential, that's crucial. Also, we were quite impressed, I have to say, with the maintenance biter that is shared between your library and your building maintenance, your building manager. It really contained a lot of key information. And what was particularly impressive was the flow of information across departments. It was one of those things, library maintenance, where it's not specifically clear whose roles and responsibilities are in maintaining the library. From the board's perspective, you want the library maintained to provide the services for your community. That's where it ends. But who does what in supporting that? That can create some tension, but your departments were able to work quite collaboratively to ensure that information is, that accountability is fleshed out, and then information is retained so that you can have that iterative process of maintaining it. So great information there. And then, like we said, inventory of assets exists for most assets. They're just in different forms, and that's not uncommon, so no alarm there. Spreadsheets, you got cemetery spreadsheets over here, you've got your GIS over here, you've got your library binder over here. And I have to caution the board, and an asset management software is not it's not a savior. It's not something that will save the organization or necessarily advance asset management at a quickest pace in the early stage. It's just more about ensuring that you have data generally available, broadly available to the people that need it. Okay. So you'll actually notice we didn't recommend that you implement asset management software. We think there's foundational processes and that can be focused on over the next 5-year roadmap. Some challenges, again, asset information is not generally accessible for all departments. And asset management, again, it's across departmental functions. So if you all are rowing in the same direction, for those of you that are impacted by those decisions or have a stake in those decisions, it would be good to have information accessible in that way. There are information gaps that exist for inherited assets. Again, this is not at all unique to this regional district. Every regional district struggles with inheriting assets and their age, their construction, all that sort of stuff that you need to maintain those assets. So there's going to be surprises time and again. Jamie will tell you that. And then there's some information from fields that don't consistently find its way back to the IT system. Although I have to say that there is that's being advanced. For instance, NA is working with the operations team to collect field information on the asset condition, et cetera, and integrate that back into a database. We'll also mention the lack of integration between financial systems and asset management information constrains decision-making. And again, not unique. We mentioned when talking to Carla that you are going out to ERP for a financial system. It would be nice if you could include the consideration of asset management fields and asset management functionality in that ERP system, or at least supporting a future asset management software. What you wouldn't want is an ERP system that is inflexible to the future needs of an asset management software. So if you have a ERP system that contemplates that, and that's part of your scoring, that's great. And it's not the primary evaluation criteria when you're looking at your ERP system, because your ERP system does serve other very important functions for the organization. But wouldn't it be great if it also supported asset management in the future? And then there's levels of service that haven't been currently formalized or communicated. And this is different. You know, I think there are some very clear levels of service in some areas. Your Parks Department, for instance, was able to show us they got standards that they hold the contractors to. And they make sure those standards are consistent across parks as much as possible. So that's an example of a formalized level of service. But is that necessarily communicated? And then, of course, there's other levels of service that haven't been formally adopted. And again, this shouldn't be alarming in any way. Much of the services that all local governments provide are highly regulated. So your utilities, for instance, are highly regulated. So you're required to meet those minimum levels of service every day. And your operations department, that's what they focus on 99% of the work. Making sure those levels of service are, because it would be a disaster if they weren't. But there are some choice that the board can have in higher levels of service and risk, and et cetera. And that's why we're saying it is a challenge that it hasn't been formalized in some cases. Now you do have asset management plans for your utilities. Those asset management plans outline, amongst other things, levels of service. So we do recommend later on that those asset management plans be refreshed, not redone, but refreshed, because there's a lot of good work that's been done. They're just old, that's all. And so that's an opportunity to articulate levels of service a bit more specifically. And then the work order and maintenance management is currently a manual process. Again, that's not unique to the regional district. Okay, the third area is people in leadership. So asset management is not going to be prioritized, of course, without the culture of the board prioritizing it, and then the leadership team reflecting that, and then the organization really adopting the importance of it. So this really looks at if there are cross-functional teams, because asset management is a cross-functional process. Oh boy, have I learned a lot by having conversations with engineers and operation folks and fire chiefs. Like, you just learn so much, and your financial plan really reflects supporting their operations. So it is absolutely a cross-functional process, but there has to be clear accountability. When you have a situation where you have a function that is dependent on many people, you can also experience this thing called the diffusion of responsibility, right? If you got 20 people in the room, that room is responsible for achieving something. It's everybody's and nobody's responsibility. Everyone can say, well, someone else will figure it out, right? That's just human nature, and it's definitely not what's happening in the regional district in any sort of endemic way. It's just setting up clear accountabilities really helps that cross-functional team to move forward. And then again, we just really emphasize that asset management requires an integration of multiple perspectives. And that supports, again, why the asset management policies are being translated to all your operations. And you want to have that cross-functional team and that FTE that really encourages that cross-functional team. So some strengths. You've got an experienced senior management team in place, and they seem to have a lot of enthusiasm for improving this. Because again, I think it's core to what you do at the regional district. There's good collaboration, there's good communication. There does not seem to be any clear cultural silos between your departments. Yes, there are sometimes structural silos. I think that's just normal. You don't realize necessarily what your peer department needs from you. And it's just through that unfortunately you didn't communicate something. And I've done this many times as a CFO by accident. But no one's deliberately siloing themselves. No one seems to be resenting. So again, that's a great vote of confidence for your leadership team working together and promoting that harmony. It's just, how can we facilitate communication to its greatest extent? Already mentioned commitment from the leadership board. There's consensus in terms of that need. and there's consensus on the need for procurement as well. There's currently no champion or leader, and that doesn't mean that that your leadership team isn't championing it, right? For this project, you've got Na leading the project. She's certainly a project champion. I mean, she's making sure the project is being successful. But after, she's not the ongoing champion for asset management, right? Her role is broader than that. So again, this comes back to having an FTE to say, oh, hey, Carla, I know you're in the middle of budget, but we as a team agreed that we would be reporting performance measures to the board by this date. Can you please spend 20 minutes to support that objective? Oh, and Jamie, in order for Carla to do that, Carla's looking for this information from you. So again, it's that person that is looking broadly in the organization and helping people collaborate. That's a champion that you really need. We think that can be embodied in FTE. We did talk about we had a lot of conversation about the competencies you want to see in that FTE, and one of them certainly is uniformly agreed. It has to be leadership. It has to be someone that's not just taking leadership but providing leadership. There's currently no formal cross-functional team. Certainly, your senior leadership team, Scott and Jamie and Carla and others are acting as a cross-functional team. But your cross-functional team isn't just horizontal, it's also vertical. You need operations folks, you need people there at different times as well. And so, formally establishing a terms of reference and a team and what their roles and responsibilities are and when they're going to meet, et cetera. That should happen, we believe, and your FTE, your asset management champion, could really lead that. There's a lack of clarity in how asset management fits into roles and responsibility, and that goes right down to the bottom level of your organization in terms of job descriptions and whatnot. Departments are stretched thin, and it's difficult to dedicate any meaningful time to advancing asset management. We're really looking at the recommendations that we're making to not, if and when possible, add on to the capacity constraints and concerns that your staff have, but instead replace existing processes. So if we're able to replace existing processes with more robust, broader, cross-functional, team-supported processes, then we're not adding to the capacity challenges the regional district have, but we're coordinating more efficiently across the organization. That's really what we're hoping to achieve. And I know it's easier said than done for sure. And then, so of course, that you're never going to stop hearing that lack of resources is difficult, or your lack of capacity for delivering all planned projects in some areas. The organization has been quite successful in a broad sense in achieving the projects and the spending and everything that is envisioned in the financial plan. There's some things in sometimes. Okay, so we're on, I believe, 4 of 5. This is an important one, planning and decision-making. And it includes how you document and standardize planning, anything that relates to asset management, operations and maintenance, for instance, budgeting. The scoring on this does weigh heavily on how well you're financial planning. So we'll talk about that. And then so let's just move on here. So one thing I want to mention is, at the end of this presentation, we listed some of the scorings, just the high level scores. I'm not going to go over those scores unless, I get some questions from the board on those scores. We can talk about them. But you scored well in your financial planning. And that is somewhat not unique because in BC, we do 5-year financial planning. And that is actually unique in Canada. 5-year financial planning is not something that's standard across Canada. So already BC does well. However, I have to say, being a CFO, often the level of effort put into years 2 through 5 of the financial plan is not high. That's not the case of the regional district. I have to say that the capital planning for 5 years and the operation plan for 5 years is real, it's happening. and it's to be applauded. And last year, through Carla's leadership, your staff separated your capital and operating budgets, and it was a strenuous process, and we heard that consistently. Oh boy, that was a lot of work. I hope we don't have to do that again, but it was a worthwhile exercise, and it was a one-time sort of exercise. Now, once everyone gets used to the new structure, it really supports your asset management moving forward because you've got more reliable data to understand the financial consequences of the life cycle of your asset. So if that hadn't been done, we would have scored pretty low here. And that would be one of the first things we recommended that gets done, which is a Herculean task. So kudos for having that done. A 10-year capital plan was completed. That's great. That's not common. Basic levels of service have been defined for some services, and asset management plans exist for core assets. So again, we don't think you need to throw out those asset management plans and redo them. We do think there's some updates that need to happen to make that information more relevant, but they're good. They're good and they're foundational. Some challenges is the service level expectations of the regional district residents may not be aligned with really what's capable. I mean, again, this is a consistent theme in local government. Your citizens ask for more than they're willing to pay, right? And that's the board is primarily a function of balancing priorities. And so there's just going to be those constraints that exist. The mindset towards investment, we think it needs to evolve to further consider the long term as opposed to the short term. And the asset management plans are outdated. They don't include current replacement values, and some life cycle funding targets would be useful in decision making today. But again, they set the foundational pieces that are needed in places for asset management plans. Capital cost estimates are I actually need to temper this statement here. Capital cost estimates aren't necessarily inaccurate. What has happened is that sometimes a standard of accuracy hasn't been established for certain projects. Again, this is not uncommon in local governments where, let's say, if you have a project that's occurring next year, that is a significant expenditure, you want to have really good class of estimates in place for the board to approve. Otherwise, if there's a cost overrun, it can be politically embarrassing, and it can just be embarrassing. You come back and you ask for an extra 40% increase in the budget. So clearly there should be an importance placed on the class of estimate that you put in for a highly visible, expensive, and project that's going to happen soon. That may not be the case for a project that is very conceptual in nature, that's 5 years down the road. Now, not every staff knows what is that level of clarity that the board could benefit from, that the CFO wants. So a standard could be developed. So again, I would rewrite this statement that capital cost estimates are inaccurate. That's not true. It's just they've been some capital project estimates have been developed to a lower accuracy than may be needed at that time. So we can provide some clarity to staff around when to do it and the appropriate approach to that. Again, I do think that your senior leadership team does a good job of vetting those projects. And like I said earlier, I think you're doing a good job of actually getting all the spending and projects done that are envisioned in your financial plan. So that sort of shows that vetting and filtering is happening. Carla, people might say, well, the CFO bears some responsibility in that. As a CFO, I can say we're not quantity surveyors. I don't construct personally. I don't construct sewer main. So we really need to work collaboratively on that, and the whole leadership team shows that they are working collaboratively on that, given the results. And then advancing needed projects often are dependent on receiving grant funding. And if that's the case, then what it really means is you don't have sustainable funding. If you need grants to replace a core asset, even though according to your risk your risk tolerance is you should be replacing it now. You got to wait until you're approved for a grant. That tells me that you don't have necessarily sustainable funding. And one of the recommendations you'll see later is when you update those asset management plans, also develop a complementary document, which is a financial strategy piece. And there's other regional districts that are doing this right now, just a few. It's not common. That could serve as a good example for how that looks. Okay,
Hey,
so we're getting
sorry,
close
Mr.
to the end.
Mr.
Yes,
Payne,
sir.
I'm just going to
Yes.
stop you right here. It's Chair Roden here. We're just
Great.
going to take a very quick break because I just think a
Great.
few people would benefit from a trip to the washroom. So
Great.
we will be back here in about 3 minutes, everyone.
Thank you.
All right, thank you, everyone. And we're back at it. That was a TNRD 3 minutes there. So Mr. Payne, back over to you, sir.
Thank you very much. Appreciate that. I'll just put my screen up here. Okay. There we go. Thanks everyone for bearing with me here. We're just about through everything to a recommendation, so we'll get through the rest of the content pretty quickly here. Okay, so the next competence here was contribution to the asset management plan, and I think most of this can be summarized in terms of you want to be able to support training in asset management and for appropriate positions, and also outline accountability in job descriptions for appropriate positions. So that's really, you know, there isn't dedicated training in the regional district for those positions, and there isn't a job description. So that will form a bit of a basis of our recommendations coming up right now. Okay, so these are the recommendations. And again, we'd love to hear your input. If you have any input, they've been discussed with your senior leadership team at length and formulated from the surveys. It'll show up as discrete projects and progress in the asset management strategy that you'll get shortly thereafter. So we're recommending that you adopt the asset management recommendations for policy. Ensure that there's an education plan for key staff and integrate into onboarding. Adopt the strategy and roadmap. I'd be surprised if that didn't happen. That will be forthcoming. And then develop some performance measures. You can base them on FCNS readiness scale. We do have a projection for how much your readiness scale can improve if the projects in the roadmap that's forthcoming are in fact done. In terms of data, we're recommending you develop a data standards policy. And this doesn't mean that you'll have all the data you need right away, but in fact, you will set a framework for collecting data so that when you do have, let's say, an asset management software in place or a data approach, you can go back and you'll have historical data to rely on. We're recommending that you consider incorporating asset management into the ERP system selection criteria and select a technology to house your asset inventory. And again, it can be what you're already using, but if you have a data standard that overrides that entire asset data housing, it'll set a broad framework for that. And then implement workflows to support technology, collecting field information. And I don't want to take credit for this. This work is already underway, and we just wanted to support that in the asset management strategy. Again, NA is working with the operational team to get that done as we speak. One of the main recommendations coming out of the strategy will be to establish your FTE. My understanding is that the budget has been established for it. It's just that your team was determining the best how that position looked and what their responsibilities were. Recommending establishing a formal asset management steering committee. And when I say committee, it's really like a staff level committee, not a governance level committee. You've got governance committees in place to support receiving information, but it's really a cross-departmental staff committee. And then the terms of reference would guide what that committee does. Priorities would be set by senior management, which of course takes direction from the board, but that would be integrated into the terms of reference for that steering committee and chaired by your new FTE. In terms of the planning and decision-making competency, we're recommending that you develop a framework for assessing asset conditions and incorporating into workflow. So you already have, again, in your asset management plans, you're required to look at your asset conditions. Your operations team, they're doing this all the time because they need to know where to spend their money rather than just reactive maintenance, for instance. But establishing, again, that condition framework is good for corporate posterity. Develop a framework to assess the criticality and risk of failure for core assets. Again, this is already being done intuitively, just not formally, and you can see that your capital prioritization projects follow these principles. we're recommending you develop unit rates for core linear assets, and then you can update the replacement and understand the replacement costs annually. So you can link the linear asset costs to a index, a capital cost instruction, increase index. That way you've got live information in terms of what your costs are every single year. Your CFO can have that in the financial plan. Your operation teams understand what it takes for different capital projects. And you can refresh those unit rates more formally every 5 years, but in between that, you can have some very good and live information. One of the discrete projects you'll see in the roadmap will be to update your asset management plan with new replacement values and integrate life cycle funding requirements. And then you can complement that with a sustainable funding strategy. And we understand regional districts are going to have a different funding strategy for every single service, which is a significant amount of work. But you as a board and your operations team, they can understand the funding challenges by service and have a strategy to address that by service with the goal of overall financial sustainability. In terms of contribution to asset management plan, you know, we don't think it's necessary at this stage for you to be a thought leader in the organization, for the board to be attending a ton of asset management, professional development opportunities, or your staff, just more of a targeted group of folks. But we do recommend incorporating asset management responsibility into key job descriptions, ones that really do influence overall asset management progress. And then lastly, you want to establish a high-level training plan for AM. So again, this doesn't mean you're spending 30 grand on a project that has a really in-depth training plan. It's just get your asset management committee together to decide what positions could really use training and what specific training, and write it down. And that's it. So it can be really robust and really effective at achieving your core areas. So I think that will be, just about, this is the last slide here before, if there's any questions. Again, we do have all of the ratings in the back. You'll see more detail of that in the actual asset management strategy, just for interest's sake. But this is really the last slide. Other than that, in terms of what's going to happen next, we're going to prepare a draft of the asset management strategy. That'll be taking place mostly next week, actually, assuming that the board doesn't have any direction here that would contradict that. And then we'll review that draft with your senior leadership team, finalize it, and bring it to you bring it to the board. I know this is a policy, or this is a committee. Bring it to the board for formal adoption. So that'll be it for the end of the presentation slides. John and I are here. We're ready for any questions that you may have. We look forward to your input, and we thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you very much, Mr. Payne, Mr. Wenninger. And I do see Director Sau with his hand up. Anyone else want to jump in? All right, Director Getz, Director Sau, Director Getz, Director Laird to start off with.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I got two issues I would like to discuss. For these recommendations for board adoption considerations, would it be, in your opinion, that there's more administrative tasks and change management and business solutions requiring more staff capacity to carry them out? Or like, basically, my question is, are there more new tasks needing staff time? Or is it, as you mentioned a few times, you feel we already carry it out and we just need to document it? FTE's already been budgeted. Yeah, what is your opinion on that? Thank you.
Thanks. So I'll give my answer, and I'm pretty sure that John will have a similar answer, but I'll invite him as well to provide his perspective. Our approach here was really to ensure that the processes and enhancements that we're recommending in terms of the asset management strategy and roadmap supplanted existing processes so that they didn't add to capacity constraints in organizations. That being said, that really can't be done without a focused FTE in asset management to coordinate those efforts, right? So again, everyone's doing different things that support asset management in their own individual way. For instance, the CFO asked your staff corporately to separate capital and operating project, and that supports asset management. But that information that can be gathered now can be used by your various departments to support their planning, right? So it's processes like that that corporately can be done with existing capacity that will hopefully supplant existing efforts. So, I wouldn't want to say black or white. It's not going to constrain capacity in any way more than that, but that's really how we focus our efforts when we formulated our recommendations. John, did you have anything to add to that, or does that make sense to you?
No, that makes sense. Thanks, Chris. I would say going forward in the very near term, as some of these projects that are outlined in the strategy are undertaken, there could be a little bit of extra work per staff, depending on if there is a full-time an FTE that takes the champion role and what they can take on. But I think ultimately, over time, it should make things more efficient. The goal would be. So, for example, you maybe have some information gaps that need to be filled, and that takes a little bit of work at the beginning. But once that's there, you save time, but not searching for it every year, and it's more at your fingertips, and it's going to support decision making. So ultimately, I think it should create efficiencies, but certainly in the near term, there could be a little extra work that needs to be accomplished.
Thank you for that. Second issue regarding the champion for advancing asset management. I know in some organizations, when we try to do more cross-functional meetings and such, it becomes a death by a million meetings. So while I appreciate, third-party consultation recommendations, may I ask for our CAO to give some comments, like in your opinions on some of these recommendations? Thank you.
Through the chair to Director Sao, if you recall last year when we talked about asset management, we actually had the discussion about the need for potentially one FTE to help us with this. And I believe that was actually built into the budget going forward, and was part of our SWOT analysis. That'll be coming forward again during this budget process. So you'll have lots of time to ask questions and for us to provide more of a justification on why we think that would be important. So as far as the recommendations go, that's from an FTE standpoint, it would be only the one that we're seeking for 2025. Yep.
Thank you, Director Getz.
Yeah, thank you for the presentation. Just a quick question. As a city, one of the things that we've done with our asset management is we turn ROI into it, return on investment. Is that going to be involved in this? I'm just curious.
Through the chair, I think ROI is another way of saying basically life cycle costing, right? I mean, of course, there's some services that produce a revenue that could be considered a return on investment. Ultimately, they're subsidized through taxation or some other means. So really what you look at is your life cycle cost. Now, if you can invest in a piece of capital that provides the services that's in your vision that reduces the life cycle cost, that's your return on investment, right? So I think we're talking the same concept using a little bit of different terminology. And so I would answer your question, yes.
Director Laird.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I had a question on the Community Improvement Fund. It was one of the items that was talked about just right at the start of the presentation. We just put in a policy to deal with our community improvement funds. It includes exactly how it can be spent. I was wondering have you looked at any other of our reserve funds to help improve infrastructure costs? So like you picked out one small community improvement fund that comes from the federal government. But did you look at any other reserves that you could actually say, yes, we can put these into improving our infrastructure in different parts of our budgets?
Through the chair. No, that wasn't specifically part of the scope of work. Mind you, I do believe that when there's a couple things underway that would support exactly what you're asking for, right? The integrated reserve and surplus policy review being done by your CFO, complemented with if you have the funding strategy that comes after your asset management plan gets update. Part of that funding strategy would be looking exactly at that. You know, the board has options to invest in their reserves for the replacement of its assets, maybe earn some investment revenue to offset what would otherwise be taxation costs, or perhaps incur debt and pay debt servicing later on. Those are sort of the decisions you can make in your funding strategy that impacts your reserves. So, you know, I do believe those questions would be answered in some of the projects that we're recommending, but not specifically part of the scope of work that we undertook so far.
Thank you.
Director Morris.
Thank you. My question is around, I guess, a longer term and possibly just an agenda item for another time frame as well. But it relates to the independent systems that exist throughout, example, Area P, and how are we going to factor in accounting for the fact that many of these may come our way for the future to be taken over by us, and where and how we're going to start to really address that? Because in my area alone, as you know, there's probably 6 of them. So asset management could be asset increase in terms of the types of systems, and how are we going to address that? And maybe that is a future meeting, but I just want to keep that forefront as well.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Vieira's actually got an answer for that one.
Yeah, excellent question through the chair. We have an existing policy in our utility system around acquisition of other systems. And so what that very, very briefly, the way that policy is worded is that for us to take on any systems, they must meet, you know, the criteria of all interior health requirements and essentially are functional and do not become a liability right off the bat. So that sort of protects us, if you will, from taking on systems that are a major infrastructure deficit right off the bat. Then if we take them on, then we would build them into asset management plans. So it's a long way of saying we don't need to factor them into our asset management plan because they're not our assets right now. And we have a policy that protects us that if a new asset, we're acquiring a new asset in a water or wastewater system, that the condition will be at a point that it is reasonable for us to plan for asset replacement and initiate an asset management plan from that point.
And I believe the key word in that sentence is if, because we cannot be compelled to take on a new water system. Thank you. Any other questions? No other questions? Going once, going twice? Sold. All right. Well, thank you very much, gentlemen, for your presentation, and look forward to following this asset management journey as it unrolls.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right, so we do, as I said, have an additional item on the agenda, which is the boundary review discussion and next steps. Before we get into that, just a little housekeeping note. I realize all of us are busy people and we're frequently looking at messages on our phones that come in that require our urgent attention. If they don't require our urgent attention, perhaps we can put our phones away or at least not acknowledge them during presentations. These presenters were not in the room to see what was happening, but it just is not a great look. If we can make our school children put their phones away for the school day, then I think that we as adults should be able to ignore the siren call of our cell phones for 2.5 to 3 hours. However, that said, we are busy people. I know we all have reasons that we might have to take an important phone call or message. And perhaps if it is that urgent, just maybe quietly step outside. Thank you very much. We move on to 4.3 boundary review discussion, and I'm going to hand it over to Corporate Officer Lois to lead the discussion, it says here.
Thank you, Chair. Perhaps I shouldn't have phrased that quite so strongly in the update. Yeah, so I just wanted to essentially, so we wanted the staff to bring this back and note that this was a request from a couple of years ago now, and of course it has not been forgotten, but unfortunately it has not advanced I'd like to say as far as you might have expected, or anything like that far, indeed. So I figured we would begin just by reviewing how we got to where we are, and then a couple of points about the terms of reference that have been adopted and the proposed committee. So back in June of 2022, there was initially a motion calling for a boundary review, which was passed, but was then delayed due to the election. And then when this new board sat, about 6 months into its term, you adopted the terms of reference for a committee in May of 2023. This had a couple of changes and comments after staff at that point had consulted with the ministry and determined there were a lot of questions that they would like answered, or unclear things that they wanted to identify. And so, among other things, the word governance was added to that, as there was a concern about wanting to fully understand what the committee was intending to do, and if it should be looking at things like services composition, as well as the boundaries of the regional district. So the terms of reference that you adopted stated there would be a maximum of 12 members on the committee. You then proceeded to appoint 14 members to the committee. So that's a fairly simple thing that we can easily just check off and move to 14. But I did just want to confirm that directors Blackwell, Onslow, Grenier, Bass, Hall, Laird, Thorpe, Horton, Morris, O'Reilly, Robin Smith, Stamer, Sarai, and Roden still wanted to sit on this. If that membership was to be unchanged, then I presume we would simply read Stamer as Kerslake. So the first thing, I did not want to assume anything. We expect that the board is still in favor of proceeding, but we did want to confirm that with you all in a meeting before we devote significant time to this. Then, having done that, in order to aid in getting that committee with very mildly altered terms of reference underway as soon as possible, to get direction on priorities. Because unfortunately, due to staff turnover, that did not proceed any further. The terms of reference were adopted in May of 2023. I started here about 6 months later, and there had been no progress, and we're now basically picking it up from that point. So that committee has not yet met. So I wanted to essentially ask some questions about what the hope was that the committee would be considering and aiming at, particularly with the use of the word, because you did include the word governance in the adopted one, the adopted terms of reference. And there was a comment about services in there. So services that we operate in the TNID, they typically come up somewhat ad hoc and on request. For example, when notices of motion are brought to this board to instruct staff to then do research and write reports on what a new service might look like. We are looking at the possibility of a new service creation policy that might formalize things. And so I was thinking it might be a good idea, if you want the committee to be looking at service establishment, to be running that policy through that committee as well as the normal route through policy and governance and the board. And of course, as Director Morris just brought up, this could potentially have an asset management component as well, if it results in, say, service changes and bringing in new services to the TNID that already exist in other aspects. And the other question that I was wondering about is, when you wanted to look at boundaries of the TNID, would this be a purely external matter, so setting terms of reference for studies with the provincial government and our neighboring provincial regional districts? Or would it also include our internal boundaries, which must be set by letters patent and sometimes have unexpected consequences? So one that we discovered earlier this year, there was a notice of motion from the director representing Sun Peaks, because the municipality of Sun Peaks is included within the Kamloops statistical census metropolitan area. Not because Sun Peaks is actually very well connected to Kamloops itself, but because it is entirely surrounded by electoral area P, and area P is connected to Kamloops. And when I discussed that with Statistics Canada and was asking to get their logic on why it was included, they sent me some extremely zoomed in maps showing that at the northern limits of the boundary, the Area O boundary is less than, I think, 10 meters away from the Sun Peaks municipal boundary, but they do not touch at any point, as a result of which Sun Peaks is completely surrounded and must be statistically included in everything that Area P is included in. So that's the kind of, were you looking at a review of internal boundaries as well when looking at this lattice patent, or was this meant to be a purely external boundaries thing? And so I think those are my key points, and then I'd be very interested in hearing any comments or discussion from the board. And as I say, expecting that you will want to continue with this, we will then set a meeting of the committee as soon as can be arranged.
Thank you. I'm going to let Director O'Reilly just clarify, because it was Director O'Reilly, if I'm casting my mind way back to when this first, no, sorry, I'm going to put you on the spot, Director O'Reilly. But it was Director O'Reilly's idea to go ahead with this. So I'm going to ask him what his intent was with the boundaries, internal, external, or all of the above.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thanks for those comments. I guess a couple of things. One, it was to do with the external boundaries and not looking at internal at this point. It's really understanding the boundaries where we are as a whole. But I do think we should be talking to other RDs, our neighbors, to see if there's efficiencies that they may find and they may be interested in trying to work and shifting our boundaries more into their areas or not. And that discussion needs to happen. Obviously, the province does need to be involved. At the end of the day, the province is the one that's going to sign off and allow us to do this. And I think it's integral to have them have a seat at the table, or at least being involved, so that if we present something, we know it's sort of in line, rather than them saying, you guys are nuts, what are you thinking? I think they need to be a part of this process.
Thank you. And just spare a thought for Director Kerslake, who suddenly finds himself on a committee that he knows nothing about and has no background on whatsoever. So, all right, I'm going to open it up. Does anyone have any questions? Director Laird, go ahead.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just have a question around the expense of doing this restructuring. Have we got any indication if we're having any funding sources, or I don't think we're looking at an inexpensive study that we're going to do. It'd be very costly. And is it something the board really wants to spend taxpayers' money on? It's just it's a decision we have to make. And if we're going to decide to go forward with this, we have to have funding in place for the whole project, not just starting it, because there's no point in starting it, not finishing it.
Through the chair to Director Laird, certainly at this point, the only expense would be staff time, and we are prepared. That's something that we can certainly accommodate within existing budgets and staffing levels. There hasn't been any look at external funding to cover any of that, though.
Any idea that the staff time that would be involved? Because if when you take staff time to do something like this, there's other things that come in, and you know, it isn't a huge undertaking, and I don't want to start down this trail unless we're, as a board, are feeling very strongly about taking staff time now, even to get started at it.
Thank you, and again through the chair. So the staff time would be things like, say, staff in the committees performing research requested by the committee. It certainly wouldn't be nothing, but at the same time, staff did commit to this at the when the notice of motion was approved and when the terms of reference were created. We don't feel that it would be an imposition. It's certainly something that we can accommodate. It is obviously, I mean, we always do assign the work that needs to be done. This was something that was intended to be done in the last year. It was only not done due to staff turnover, and so I think we're quite confident that that can be handled at this time.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Director Onslow?
Thank you for that. I joined this committee because I'm not entirely clear as to what the main goal is to accomplish. And so is it to make the TNRD smaller? Is it to create another level of government, like another regional district? Is it to put the outlying areas in with their neighboring regional districts? So That's why I joined the committee, and I would certainly like to have clarification on that. And I thought that would come from being on the committee. But I also have huge concerns that it's easy to push the outlying areas that are within the TNRD outside of the TNRD if another regional district would take them. But that is not going to benefit a lot of the residents, in my opinion.
Director O'Reilly, I will let you answer this one.
Thank you, Madam. Thank you, Madam Chair. And I think I'm speaking to this more because it came up back in 2020. And so you weren't part of the initial debate as we were having it around the table. Where this stemmed from was just the high level conversation. Are we providing the best service and the best level of government to the residents of the TNRD the way that we're structured at this point? When we look at our board with how many people are on here, are we getting the most efficiency from these board meetings? And should we look at a boundary review? And where it was suggested was the last time the boundaries were looked at and when we were created was, I'm going off the top of my head, sorry, Madam Chair, about 1956 or 1960, 67, sorry, was the last time those were looked at. This isn't presupposing that we need to get rid of EAs or certain towns. This isn't splitting the TNRD into, it's just looking what's around us and is there a way we could be looking at do this differently? And that's all this is. This isn't saying we need to push off to other RDs. This is looking at having the conversation. Are we providing the best service possible for the residents? And I don't think we should presuppose anything. And it may very well say, hey, we are providing the best governance possible and the best services for our residents. And it very well may say that. We just felt it was worthwhile to have that conversation and to look at those boundaries, especially as the population is changing and through the letters patent and how many votes are being talked around here. And when we talk about weighted votes and financial decisions, which municipalities, we are getting more and more. And obviously City of Kamloops now has 7 on this board. We did have 5, now 6, now 7, right? And so those are changing basis. The population is distributing as well. And so the board felt it was worthwhile to look at that and have those discussions. And that's why a committee was being pushed to set that up.
Thank you for that.
Director Grenier?
Thank you for that last little explanation. And so this idea of boundaries, it seems to be more than just boundaries. It seems to be sort of the composition of the board representing the existing area of the board as well. So when you identify weighted vote, and what has become obvious to me since I've been on the board is that there are programs that the TNRD puts on that are specifically for EA areas that some municipalities don't participate in. When we look at our overall budget, municipalities participate in some, not all, and so that has implications. So I would hope that the scope of this boundary review also is that internal review of representation, weighted vote. Just want to make sure that that's part of the scope.
Thank you, Director Grenier. And I think that goes back to where we were at the initial intent of this motion in 2020 was to look at the external piece first. And once we've got that looked at, then look at the internal boundary and the weighted votes. But what I was suggesting is that the weighted votes is changing and it's changing all the time, especially in your area as well. As the populations around the main centers is growing, those weighted votes are changing as well. But at this point, it was looking at the external. As long as we're comfortable with that, then we look at the internal piece, was the intent of the original motion.
If I could, I would hope that we could, having had this discussion, make sure that we look at both at the same time, because I think the external part is also related to the internal governance. We have 10 electoral areas that are creating the area, and yet the weighted vote is sitting with the City of Kamloops. And that seems to be maybe out of sync for some categories, like in libraries where everybody participates. I think that's a fairly obvious one. But when we're dealing with other areas where the weighted vote isn't even participating in it, it seems to be a problem. And I don't know that the boundary change, the physical boundary change would be as much as a change in how we address some of those items where that weighted vote doesn't participate. So I'm just wondering if in your opinion, that it's the geographic and the internal should be looked at the same time.
Yeah, I'll just mention the first one and then Director Roden wanted to comment. Again, that the initial intent was to look at the external boundaries. And having this many directors around a table, is it efficient? Really, and that's sort of where it stemmed from and came from. But on the weighted vote piece, I'll leave it to Director Roden. But that, again, the initial intent, and maybe that changes. And I think there's probably some stuff to do with letters patent that Director Lois would like to talk about. But certainly the initial intent was to look at our external boundaries, and that's where it stood.
The weighted vote is by legislation. We have no control over that. It is only on certain votes that have to do with financial matters. And we cannot change the formula that comes from the province. It's based purely on population. So there is really nothing that we can do to change that. I would suspect that Kamloops has a disproportionate voice simply because we are such a large board. I was talking to fellow regional district chairs at UBCM, and I would say to them, how many people are on your regional district board? 12, 11, 10. I'm like, wow, that's 7. That must be really interesting and a very different atmosphere, not better, not worse, just different. So the weighted vote is not, there's nothing we can do about that. The only way we could do it is to start, I don't know, radically increasing the populations in a lot of the electoral areas. Because that would increase the number of weighted votes that an electoral area has. Corporate Officer Lois.
Thank you, Chair. And I just wanted to reiterate something Director Grenier essentially noted, sorry, not Grenier, Director O'Reilly noted near the beginning that the province must be involved in this because our boundaries, both internal and external, are set by letters patent. The weighted votes are set by letters patent. When we must use weighted votes is set by legislation. So anything that the board wanted to request changes to, it would ultimately come down to provincial decision on for the areas that can be changed unique to us. For example, where lines are on a map, that's something they can set for us through the letters patent, through the legislation that says when weighted votes must be used on the awarding of contracts, on the operation of services according to members. That's something which is set in legislation in the Local Government Act.
Thank you. I have Director Laird, Director Lepso, Director Houghton, and Director Sow.
I was just wondering if this wasn't a service review where you look at the services that are being provided and see if they're actually working in our within our regional district boundaries. And I think if you did the service review, it might bring it to re-looking at boundary. So if you don't do the service review, I don't think you'd be able to look at changing boundaries or anything within our TNRD, because at TNRD, basically, that's what we do as a board. We provide services, and we have to, I think if we're going to do anything, we need to look at services and make sure they're being provided, and then we can, from there, you know what you need to do after that. That's just my thought.
Thank you. Director Lepso.
Thank you very much. So as Chase is on fringe of the TNRD, I had a discussion with the mayor, Salmon Arm, and his first thing was, why? And he mentioned during the wildfire that as they were a smaller regional district, he admired the resources that we had being such a large district. Yeah, he wished he would have had the resources that we had. And that's one thing that would concern me is if we do shrink, how do we keep the level of service staff here without increasing taxation? And I also like coming here and I can talk to other people, I can talk to other mayors. And basically it's just, I think it's a great idea having we have a lot of power when we go to other levels of government. when we have a larger group coming together. So I think things are going good the way they are. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Director Houghton.
As a newbie on this board, I in my John Deere days, traveled around the geographic area of our whole TNRD and the Caribou Regional District. And I think we're very unique in a makeup of a regional district. We've got one major large center being Kamloops, and it's surrounded by electoral areas. Then within those electoral areas, we have smaller communities with mayors and councils like yourself, like Roland and others. I think we're very unique. We're not one city with going out to Bella Coola like Williams Lake and yeah, you take in 100 Mile maybe. But I think we're all important as each other, whether it be the rural parts to the fringe, and we keep bringing that word fringe up all the time, and the municipalities within our electoral areas. I think this is very unique from what I see, a little bit I know about local politics, because it's nice to see local communities represented here. It doesn't matter how big they are, with a voice. And electoral areas, we only have one voice. Doesn't matter how many geographic miles of land we got to look after. We got 3,000 people or something in our, or if we've got 1,500. I think we're all important as each other, and I think we better take some tender steps on this one. Thank you.
Thank you, Director Sal.
Thank you, Chair. I just wanted to confirm and get Mr. Lewis's opinion at the very bottom line. So the board will get the report and recommendations, and only the board will be able to take action. Or if, as Mr. Lewis, I think that what he said earlier concerns me when he says the provincial government has to be involved. Would it become a case where then it becomes based on the recommendations, we're told what to do by the province? Just sharing something from Area A, the Birch Island Fire Protection Public Assent process, where our staff had one interpretation of the legislation. It turned out in the end, the province told us what to do, how to carry it out against our own internal recommendations. So my concern is, can we distinguish right now, like if this report comes out at the end of this review, do we have power to limit on who gets to tell us what to do? Thank you.
Corporate Officer Lois.
Thank you through the chair, Director. So the process would be the committee would make recommendations to the board, which would then use those recommendations, if it adopted them, to lobby the government. The province would have to be involved at all steps, and we would not be able to make any changes without the authorization of the Lieutenant Governor and Council.
Director Bass.
Thank you. I didn't realize it's been 67 years since this was reviewed. Life was different back then. This area was different back then. It's just for the value of reassessing it almost 7 decades later, it makes sense to me. And then when I hear Greg say we'd have to get the government to make changes, that won't happen in my lifetime. But I see value in at least looking at it to see if we do need to change things. That's why I asked to be on the committee. 67 is a long time, a lot of years.
And Vice Chair Smith.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just have a question. And just to be clear, I like the makeup of the board the way that it is and appreciate the size of the board that we have, even though we are unique in the province. My question is around Indigenous governance and how they may fit into our structure at some point in the future, and how we would accommodate them. I know we've had some discussion about specifically the space that we're in right now and how that would even happen in the future. So I guess that's my question.
Thank you through the chair to Director Smith. That is a really good question. And obviously, as we continue down the path of reconciliation, a very live issue that a lot of governments are dealing with. At this point, there is only provision in BC law for treaty First Nations to participate directly in the boards of regional districts, and we do not have any treaty First Nation governments within the TNRD. However, if there were future legislative changes, then that could result in a change to the composition of our board. Obviously, there are a great many First Nations within our boundaries, and we are doing our best to work closely and collaboratively with them. We're signing new MOUs, for example, and we're always seeking to increase our levels of consultation and cooperation. But the composition of our board would always have to be governed by the legislation. So that would be determined by any future changes to the Local Government Act.
Thank you. And Director O'Reilly.
Thank you. I think, sorry, Director Getz is up there too. I think the discussions that we're having right now are exactly why we need to have this discussion at a committee level where we can dig in further. And when we talk about a potential First Nations piece, the government has signaled that they are going to have voting seats around the table at some point. And we know that's coming. But I go back, and sorry, I don't have my notes from when this first went through in 2020. I was just looking at it. But again, the question that I put to the board at the time was, if there's anybody here that can tell us why or explain why these lines were arbitrarily drawn and it was the best way to govern our area in the 60s, I'd love to hear it. But at this point, I think it's worth having this exact discussion that we're having right now. And the recommendation that may come out of the committee say, hey, everything's fine. And when we talk about services that are within the boundaries, that will all come out. And that's why staff will be at the table as well, saying, well, this needs to say because we do this here in different areas. This isn't saying that we're going to split. This isn't going to say that we need to, or you're going away, this is going away. This is a discussion about the boundaries that were drawn in the 60s. That is where this is coming from, and that was the whole intent. Thank you.
And of course, if you look at the alphabet of electoral areas that we have, we are obviously missing a few letters, and that's because in some cases we had those electoral areas and they have since disappeared. So it has changed over time, the boundaries, and of course we have added communities like Clearwater Barrier, Sun Peaks, Logan Lake. Since 1967 was Logan Lake. No, you weren't incorporated till 72.
No, we were 71.
71. So we have added communities and we have changed the electoral boundaries. So it's not as if it was created in 1967 and written in stone. And probably an opportunity to go back and take a look at some of just to, and Director O'Reilly, I remember from 2020 was quite clear that he was not proposing changing anything. It was simply going to be a review. And we could well come out of it saying, let's not change what isn't broken. But at least we would know that it's not broken and we'd have these discussions. Director Getz, I understand from your semaphoring that you had a question.
Well, one thing we have to take into consideration of First Nations is the second word. It's a nation that works amongst themselves to a certain degree. We have to take that into consideration that I think the formation of having First Nations involvement is that they form a group that works with ours because when we look at certain things, like if the Chancellor of Germany comes over to Canada, he doesn't come and see a mayor. He sees the Prime Minister of Canada because it's a separate nation. So I think that's where we have to work for First Nations involvement, because I've had several conversations with the chiefs that do feel left out of TNRD, but absolutely want nothing to do with it. So it's kind of weird. And I think the thing is that they're a nation and they need to figure out how they work into this program, because I don't want to say it's a step down, but to a certain degree, they are a nation that needs to figure out how they need to work with regional districts and come into this picture. And that's all I'm saying. It's something we have to consider with that.
You, Director Morris.
A very brief comment. Thank you, Chair Worden. I just would caution that we we need to look at the boundary discussion. And what I'm hoping is that it doesn't turn into a massive project that diverts our ability to invest our time and whatever available dollars we have to support specific initiatives that are positive for the TNRD as a whole and the communities within it. So I just want to be that we're cautionary on that as well.
Any other questions or comments? CAO Hildebrand.
Thank you. Just a brief comment. I know people are mentioning 2020, but we'll feel bad enough that we've missed this already. It was 2022, just to be clear.
My apologies. The previous board, I could leave it. COVID was a bit of a blur. It was all the same. Thank you.
We're going to blame it on the COVID years and COVID fog, I think. It just seems like 4 years ago. That's it. All right. Any other questions or comments on this? Do we need to take any steps to increase our committee to 14 from 12?
Strictly speaking, Chair, if the terms of reference were to be modified, that would have to be done at the board level, not the committee of the whole level. So I'm not at this point. But I will certainly, we'll send the invitation out to all 14 appointed members, and I'm sure that can just roll into some future board meeting.
Thank you. All right. Well, on that note, we will adjourn. Everyone have a safe weekend and see you everyone in 2 weeks' time.